Dive. Joining me now is criminal defense attorney Hector Diaz of Diaz Law. Hector, you know, it's such an emotional and impactful story to hear, even though it was nearly 7 years ago, from the Goldman family. Will his family, as well as Nicole Brown Simpson's family, ever see that money that was owed to them?
You know, they have not seen, a significant portion of the verdict. I think it was $35 million. And I expect that those same obstacles that they've faced, when OJ was alive, that they're going to continue to meet those same issues when they go after the estate, because now OJ's children, OJ's family are going to likely raise the same kinds of issues and arguments that the Goldmans are entitled to certain monies because they, are a certain designated type of property related to his pension and all sorts of issues. So I think the one certainty here is it's going to continue to be in court for quite some time.
Yeah. Let's go back to that murder trial. Back then, it was known as the trial of the century. There were so many things about this case that truly made its mark in history. So I want to take you back to the events that unfolded. June 1994. We all remember where we were when that Bronco chase happened throughout Southern California. Then the trial of the century in 1995. You had the dream team of defense lawyers, Johnny Cochran and Robert Shapiro versus prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. And then who could forget that key moment when OJ struggled to put on the gloves from the crime scene, leading Johnny Cochran to famously say these words:
"If it doesn't fit, you must acquit."
Not guilty of murder, and the fallout highlighted race in America. Hector, talk about the legacy that this case left behind.
And I get goosebumps just when I see this. I remember where I was at when, I was in college when this verdict came down, and this case highlighted race in the criminal justice system. It had always been an issue, but it really brought it to America's living room. For 9 months, every day, we were affixed to this, and it highlighted a lot of things. For many, many years, TV wasn't showing trials. They weren't showing these kinds of things. And now they're the norm that we see today. And I think, in some respects, the biggest piece of this, besides the issues of race and the issues of in terms of the lawyers that were involved here, some of the arguments they made here and the questions that were raised, was the fact that you had now really the criminal justice system pushed into the living room. Things that really were a mystery for many people, only reading in books. Now they were front and center every day.
The DNA evidence.
Absolutely. The science of DNA was evolving at that time. And OJ's lawyers made the DNA issue as if it was the central piece of the case, when in reality it really wasn't. And they were able to kind of paint a picture in terms of whether law enforcement had done more than just simply made mistakes, but had engaged in some kind of misconduct on their own. So there are a lot of things. I think there are a lot of lasting effects from this. But the big one is just where we've seen these kinds of criminal trials. There wasn't high profile before O.J. Simpson. This was the high profile case, and it continues. I mean, there have been a lot of other cases that have come since the O.J. trial.
But really nothing like this, though.
No. Absolutely not. And there's a lot of questions of whether we'll ever see anything like this, because, the courts likely learned from some of the, the antics and the shenanigans that went on there on TV in the courtroom, and a lot of questions about the judge in this case, whether he had control over the courtroom. And there are a lot of judges that would probably be reluctant to ever have something like this go on again in their courtroom.
And the cameras in the courtroom, that was huge too.
Absolutely.
We were talking about this in the newsroom and the impact that it had. And, for us, the Gen Xers, we all remember it vividly, right? But there's so many people who weren't even born. For the younger generation who have no idea, who never saw this play out in front of their living rooms. Why is this so important? Why should they realize this moment in history?
It's history.
It
is history. In fact, I know there are college courses that teach about the O.J. trial. They made movies about this, and it's, in many respects, this was reality TV before reality TV. And so I think it is something that when you look at what was going on at that time, you had a lot of discontent between certain sectors of society. There were a lot of racial issues that were going on.
Well, especially after the Rodney
King,
yeah,
absolutely.
beating, yeah.
And so it was a part of our history that really, again, in terms of some of the things that went on and, that obviously we hope are not going to be repeated. So again, it's part of history. It'll always be there. There'll be stories that'll continue about this trial and about the lawyers and about, and I think it's just the publicity that it got and in how sometimes the perfect storm happens and you have a situation like this and we all want to see it.
All right, Hector, thank you.